This is the big contradiction with Marx. You need capitalism to get to socialism, but capitalism is inherently bad. And because of this inflationary pressure, money is losing its value.
Yeah.
Now, rather than a wartime government going, oh crap, how do we stop this? They go, oh no, this is a great opportunity to achieve communism, because communism necessitates that money doesn't exist, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So what war communism is this amazing thing where they're both simultaneously doing it because of the necessities of the war, but they're also doing it because of the necessity of ideology.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Daniel Freeman. This is the first in a three-part series on the rise and fall of the Soviet economy. Today we'll be discussing Russia's economy in the dying days of the Romanov dynasty, the October Revolution and the changes that brought, and why Lenin ended up adopting the new economic policy. To do so, I'm joined by Aymen Aulaiwi, who is a DPhil student at Lincoln College, Oxford, and who has written an article on this topic for IEA Insider, the link to which you can find in the description. So, Aymen, to start off with, before we get into the Soviet Union and the changes it brought to Russia's economy, how would you describe Russia's economic state in, say, 1900 by comparison to other countries in Europe?
Well, thank you for having me on, first of all. It's a very exciting opportunity to talk about this. I think, when people think about the Soviet Union, Soviet economy, it almost seems like a distant, faraway place that doesn't have really any relation to us today. But actually, I think there's a lot of historical parallels that still apply today, but also it's very important to know our history, right? I mean, because by knowing the history of the world, we know not to make the same mistakes, but also kind of have a better worldview. And so, thinking back to your first question about what sort of state Russia was like in 1900, well, essentially, you could sort of sum it up through three core factors. One, it is an inherently autocratic state. So you have the Tsar, who, rather than a king, really is the sort of supreme power within the society. And what that means is that, whereas in a sort of more monarchical society in Western Europe, where you sort of have this idea that the monarch is almost a representative of the state and therefore has to do things within the interest of the state, in Tsarist Russia, actually, a bit like, as I think it was Louis XIV, famously, je suis l'état. He is the state. I am the state, right? He is the state. He is, what he says goes. So number one, it's a hugely autocratic society. And that means, by virtue, economic policy is hugely in the hands of this one figure, who at this point is Tsar Nicholas II, who came to power following the death of his father, Tsar Alexander III. Who was quite a tyrant, whereas Tsar Nicholas II was sort of a much more soppy figure, but was very committed to autocracy. The second key factor is that the economy is largely dominated by the agricultural sector. And more specifically, the sort of peasantry who are working in the agriculture sector.
What sort of proportion of the population is working on the land at this period? If we had a...
it's quite funny you asked that, because I can, trying to think of a specific estimate, but it's over half. I mean, you're looking at...
I mean, I've seen figures of 80% plus, but even as late as 1900.
I mean, that's probably, that is highly likely. I mean, we know that the urban populations, while growing at this time, is much smaller. And so, and there is general population growth in the country, which links to my third factor, which is that actually there is some inklings of progress going on.
Such
as the fact that, the biggest indication is the population growth, because, we do see Russia at this point managing to kind of lick at the frontiers of breaking the Malthusian trap. That they're managing to produce some sort of surplus that allows for population growth to occur at a much more accelerated rate. And there is growth in the urban population. So yes, the peasant population might be around 80%. However, in the cities, actually, they are growing, they are booming, especially around Moscow and St. Petersburg, which at this point, St. Petersburg is the capital, not Moscow.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is mostly because of actually a lot of foreign money coming in, especially from Britain and France, where actually they're very interested in opening industries and businesses in the country to harness their natural resources. So that sort of helps by that kind of late 19th century globalization that is coming about. And also some degree of state-directed policy, mostly through Sergei Witte, who was the
Finance Minister
from 1891 to 1903, around that period.
Yeah.
There were earlier movements opened up through this process, but what it was essentially the state going, look, we need to rapidly industrialize Russia, so we need to influence some sort of state industrial policy, which almost sounds sort of like mirrors what current politicians today talk about, right? They need to sort of reindustrialize whatever, but they hadn't really gone through it the first time. And what he essentially starts doing is this, it kind of works on two fronts. Well, three. One, the big one, is to build these big infrastructure projects. The one that we all know is Trans-Siberian Railway. The every honeymooner's dream, right? But yeah, well, I don't know. That's what people. I don't know. People always go on honeymoons to Trans-Siberian. Well, not anymore, but that's what they used to, right? And so they create these railway networks, and that relies on the second pillar, which is to make sure that the state has some sort of control on capital allocation, but also by bringing in foreign investment and then directing it towards their needs and wants. Yeah. And a lot of the capital they're generating to sort of input into industry through protected policies.
Through tariffs. They have very high tariffs on foreign imports.
Yeah. And that's because they were mostly inspired by what was going on in Germany at the same time, in sort of the new Germany that was, we often think of Germany as the sort of age-old folkloric. I mean, it was only created in the 1870s, right? So and Italy also pursues a similar policy under Gigliotti, and it kind of becomes kind of the fanfare of the late 19th century. Yes, there's trade, globalization, but however, there is this movement to sort of focus on more protective policies.
Yeah.
And the two reasons they do this, one is to generate the capital for the investment.
Yeah.
And two, actually, which is the point that I think more nuanced economic historians like to discuss, is the fact actually it was used mostly to bolster the gold standard and to ensure that the Russian Empire stayed on the gold standard, because it was the true symbol of European civilization. But as Barry Eichengreen Green, who's a seminal economic historian on the gold standard, proves, it was sort of a volte-face. It was there was the gold standard was inherently quite you would sort of really hurt and cripple your economy just to ensure that you kept this kind of symbol of power.
Yeah. And so that's largely under Sergei Witte, and where you, as you mentioned, you get the growth in the railways and the growth in industry, particularly in St. Petersburg and Moscow and a few other places. Is anything changing in the agricultural sector during this period?
Well, in 1861, Tsar Alexander II, who's the grandfather of Tsar Nicholas II, who was known as the Liberator Tsar, he essentially does what's known as the Emancipation Proclamation, where he gets rid of serfdom. Now, serfdom, it's important to note, is similar to slavery, but not exactly, because while slavery is owning someone as one's property, serfdom is more like, I own this land, these peasants are inherently a part of this land and therefore owe me rents for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
So it's almost like a constant debt servitude, right?
And they can't leave the land without permission.
No.
Yeah.
But what the problem is because the aristocracy who owned the land, who are just these kind of, they're basically they're not bourgeois in the sense that there's innovating and they have to stay, they're just rent seekers.
Yeah.
they essentially put very punitive measures to ensure that essentially these peasants remain serfs de facto, which is crippling redemption payments, which is the payments they have to give back for being freed.
Yeah.
And two, by essentially still having control over their movements through internal passports.
And this is after the liberation.
The liberation, right?
It doesn't actually
do much. I mean, there is some evidence to suggest that there was some positive developments here and there, but largely it was not to be. And suddenly recognizing this problem, because there's kind of interesting problem with Russian agriculture on two fronts. One, you have this aristocracy, this landed aristocracy, the noblemen, the boyars, the princes, who own the land, incredibly coercive, simply want to keep these people on their land. So they're not allowing the free movement of labor because they're just forcing these people onto the land. You know, they can't go to the cities, even though many do, by escaping. But the second big problem is they're also bound to the land by what's known as the mir, or the община, which is the village commune. And because when the Emancipation Proclamation occurred, it wasn't that they granted the land to peasants as individuals, but as mirs, as village communes, as if we all collectively own this land. And how these mirs operated was that the village elders would kind of act as the managers, and every family would constantly be reallocated plots, right? So one year you might have this plot of land, but this year it's a different plot of land. And essentially this system ensured a real lack of efficiency because, there was no incentive for you to actually farm the land properly because, it might not be your land next year.
Yeah, or improve the land. Presumably you're not going to build, new irrigation, say, if you need it on this land, if it's just going to be reallocated to another family in a year's time.
Exactly. And also, in a kind of perverse way, the mir sort of developed because it was kind of used as a defense mechanism, right? Because if one of the peasants had a severe issue or debt or had to be punished, they would be sort of work as a collective to ensure that didn't occur, right?
Yeah.
Or to at least lessen the burden or just take the punishment altogether.
Yeah.
So it almost became this mutual assistance system that kind of meant that you could kind of just free ride your way through life.
Yeah. So if you were particularly successful as a peasant, a lot of the sort of excess that the surplus that you built up would effectively, through social pressure and coercion, end up being reallocated to
poorer peasants. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, talk about left-winger's dream, right? And so suddenly this figure comes about, Pyotr Stolypin. Look, this guy is not a Democrat. He is by no means a friendly man. Actually, you know why Stolypin was famous at the time? It was because the Stolypin necktie, which is how you can tie a noose. It's a very effective way. So he was known for his very repressive measures. And he also, after the 1905 revolution, which is kind of sort of pre-revolution, which sort of forced the Tsar to introduce the Duma, which is sort of just a kind of advisory legislative body, he kept telling the Tsar, I'll just get rid of them because we don't need to listen to these horrible Democrats who are trying to infringe on the system. But what he does do, which is very positive, is something called the Stolypin land reforms, which he launches in 1906. I mean, before that, he'd already sort of known that the peasants needed help. So he reduced the redemption payments and eventually tried to get them abolished. But what he does in 1906 is he launches this system where peasants could have their land enclosed. So they could finally have their own private plots, their own private farms.
And it doesn't get redistributed every year.
It doesn't get redistributed. It doesn't belong to the mir. It belongs to you.
Yeah.
Right. Imagine you're Pavlik, the farmer, and, the village commune are saying, oh, well, Pavlik, you have to move to this plot. So no. Actually, I'm going to own this plot of land and it's going to be mine and I'm going to work it for my own interest. And so what does Stolypin call this? He calls it the wager on the strong. Because what he believes is that if you give these people these enclosed farmland, they will actually be incentivized to work the farm more efficiently, to invest, because you actually see the profits and you see the surplus. And a lot of peasants also think that way, because guess what? I want my own land and I want to give it to my kids. Shocking idea that, you would want your children to inherit something.
Yeah.
Once again, parallels. But what's really interesting is there is some success. About I think 3 million people sign up to do this. However, only really 1 million eventually get to enclose it, and so it ends up around 1915 to around 15% of the European Russian population having closed their land. And you see huge increases in agricultural output from 1900 to around 1915. Agricultural output increases by 33.8%. And if you don't believe in those figures, agricultural export increases by 50%. So there's huge amounts of exciting stuff going on in these private plots. The reason it's not as successful is because the mir is still very strong and there's a lot of browbeating against these peasants.
Yeah.
And so even if they did want to make innovative new corrections and sort of make their farms more efficient, that's got to fight off.
Yeah.
So...
And isn't also Nicholas II, the Tsar, a bit lukewarm on some of this reform? Because he's temperamentally incredibly conservative, reactionary almost, and anything that seems to be rocking the boat, he's a little bit cautious about giving him his full support to.
Yeah, absolutely. And
then, of course, Stolypin comes to a fairly sticky end.
He gets bombed to death in 1911.
Or he's shot. Yeah.
Do you know what? I won't lie to you. They're either bombed or shot, because I think it's Tsar Alexander II who got bombed.
Well, they attempt to bomb, various anarchists attempt to bomb Stolypin several times. He survives all of those. And then I think he's shot in an opera house in Kiev.
Very Lincoln-esque.
Yeah.
But I think that, so I mean, sadly, what
attempts at
reform did not go very well.
Yeah.
And so if I was to say, what does the Tsarist economy look like by the First World War? And you're essentially looking at a society which is agriculturally based but regressive, which is based off heavily conservative and autocratic ideals that aren't open to economic reform and opening up a free market. And you're looking at an industrial sector which is heavily propped up by state direction and is yet to really develop that really autonomous, strong bourgeois class, which do start propping up in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, who can kind of be these sort of Whiggish figures who push for free market reform.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned World War I. Obviously, Russia joins the First World War to support its ally Serbia in 1914, and on the same side as Britain and France. What's the economic effects of the First World War for Russia?
I mean, to sum it up in one word, bad. I mean, but then again, it wasn't great for anyone. I mean, the First World War, for me, at least, is probably one of the most, I think that's sort of the purpose of Remembrance Day, right? That it's probably one of the most ridiculous, stupid wars that have ever occurred. Some people really disagree with that, right? I think is that Nigel Farage sort of says, oh, no, it was a good war. And, I'm sort of like, well, I don't think a war against cousins and uncles is particularly favourable. And in Russia, it just gets so bad because the society, the economy is not built for this war.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, Russian, and this mirrors today, the Russian military are really bad at learning lessons because they'd sort of gone through a very similar war with the Japanese in 1905 and 1906, where they'd essentially, had this very old system of sort of, charging cavalry met with, machine gun fire and trench warfare.
Yeah.
And so they weren't very adaptive to this. And this wasn't helped by the fact that Nicholas II was leading the army in a very poor way. But the economy was essentially in a very bad state as well, because you didn't have the manufacturing capacity to make the necessary ammunitions and guns, which meant that soldiers would literally go out in the battlefield having to pick up the guns of the people who've just been shot.
Yeah.
Which puts a bit of a twist on the old Blackadder, the fourth.
Yeah,
jokes. But I think, so you have severe manufacturing problems. Food is not getting to the soldiers. Food is not getting into the cities because the peasants are essentially, they've either been conscripted or because the state is kind of losing face and losing power in these regions, they've just gone AWOL, anarchistic. And so the whole of the economy is nearing collapse at this point. People can't get bread. They're not doing good in the war. And so it's just non-functioning.
Yeah.
And of course, as well, they can't really get the necessary imports from their allies, France and Britain, because Turkey, which is the route to get there, is blocking the way, in Germany, of course, up in the north.
Yeah.
So it's not looking great for the Russian economy.
Yeah.
The reason maybe you could say that Britain persevered better during the First World War is precisely because the society and economy is much more dynamic, right?
And also it has access to the rest of the world in a much more straightforward way.
Absolutely. I mean, and of course, that's a very important part. But also Germany is also much more confined, and they also managed to carry on fighting for quite a bit.
Yeah.
And that is mostly just because the distribution networks exist, the railway networks exist that actually gets food to people.
Well, yeah, I mean, I remember reading in, I think it's Orlando Feige's A People's Tragedy. Great.
People never know how to pronounce his second name,
How
I don't know, because this was always debates that we always had. It's either Figgis, Feige, or Feige.
I'll go with Feige's.
But vibes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Is the before the First World War, something like 3/4 of St. Petersburg coal was coming from Britain.
Yeah.
And obviously that is cut off during the First World War because the Baltic is dominated by the German fleet. And so you're increasingly having to bring in coal from sort of the Donbass region, and it's all very sort of slow to arrive, which drives up the price, and then you have expensive food. And this all builds on itself until we get the February Revolution, which is essentially
which is the bourgeois democratic revolution, as Lenin and Trotsky would call it, right? Which is, in essence, the situation gets so bad that on, I think it was Women's Day, all these women who say, I can't afford any bread, we're going to join strikes, which had already been basically occurring amongst soldiers and manufacturers in the city, workers in the city. And they say, look, we're not happy with the Tsar anymore. You've also got to remember this time, there's lots of rumours going about with what the Tsar's up to, because they start thinking he's like a fifth column. He might actually side with the Germans because his wife's a German, and obviously get this whole Rasputin rumours and the sexual deviancy.
Yeah.
So this is often very common when people are losing wars. You sort of try and, what's he doing in his bedroom? It's very naughty. And they go on this strike, and slowly, the Tsar's not there. He's ignoring every sort of beat of mail from his minister saying, look, the situation is not good. And I think there was even a famous letter that was sent by one of his ministers to him and said, look, you have to come back to St. Petersburg and sort this out. He said, just put them down and the revolution will be finished. And he sent the telegram back saying the revolution has begun, which is very cool.
Yeah.
And the February Revolution is the point where actually they topple the Tsar. People often think of October as the point where the Tsar falls and the Bolsheviks come into power. But actually, it's a whole year kind of before that occurs, because in February, that's when the Tsarist regime collapses.
And you get the Provisional Government, which on paper is mostly liberals with some socialists who enter later, and Russia is a republic for a certain period
so
of
they
time.
form a very strange power bargaining system where in the Winter Palace, or is it the Tarid Palace, one or the other, or they might be the same thing, but they have at one end the Provisional Government, which is led originally by a guy called Prince Lvov, who is this classic liberal-minded person who would have been a member of a group called the Cadets, or at least associated with them.
Yeah.
Which is, it's quite funny, actually. I think when they told the people and they came out and they said, our new prime minister is going to be Prince Lvov, the new leader of the Provisional Government. People go, Prince Lvov, so he traded a king for a prince, what change is this? But on the other side of the palace, you have what is known as the Petrograd Soviet. Because, during this period, for some war reasons, for nationalistic reasons, they changed the name of St. Petersburg as Petrograd, because it sounds more Russian. And so you have this Soviet on the other side, which is mostly made up of these socialists. Three main groups kind of dominate it, which is the Social Revolutionaries, who were originally formed by a guy called Chernov, and then was at this time, I think, led by Martov, I believe. And they are kind of the peasant party. They're the ones who, they're not strictly Marxist. They are more based off this idea of sort of the village commune and the peasants being sort of the ideal way of life and trying to protect their interests.
Rather than the sort of more traditional Marxists who tend to emphasize the proletariat, the urban workers.
The urban workers, which is represented by the Social Democrats, who are essentially split into two groups, which are the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks, literally meaning the smaller group. This was all decided at some funny congress that happened in London earlier in the decade. Would be early in the century, if I were. Who essentially go, look, yes, we're all for proletarian workers, but we have to take our time and build a big movement where, you know, we have trade unions and parties on our side, and that we can win power democratically and sort of go through this sort of slow process of building our socialist state and eventually communism. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, led by Lenin, he is not as fond of this idea of mass democracy, because Lenin sort of speaks to a very realist tradition within Marxist thinking, which is probably how lots of Marxists feel today, which is, I'm supposed to give trust to these proletarians and these people to build their socialist revolution, but the people don't want it. So they need to be taught to want it by a vanguard party. Now, they also form because Russia is not a country with a large proletariat, right? Industry is still a relatively small part of the economy, so there aren't that many workers, proletarians, if you will. And proletarian literally just means person who's working who doesn't own any property. So about half of London. Is proletarian, you know. Well, probably even more than half. I mean, I don't know anything. But so that's his situation. So what he says is we need to be almost this revolutionary small group that's very tactical, not about building a small base. A big base, sorry. And what we need to do is to almost, you know, take control of the system in a very systematic coup d'etat way, so that we can then force society into becoming first more proletarian, then socialist, then communist, right? So it's kind of this idea that one, what divides the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks is that we're going to use, you know, a small group of people, a vanguard, who are pure and good of the ideal, so not to sort of weaken our will, to first control the state, but then obviously, rather than doing all this horrible waiting, we'll speed up the process towards socialism. Which, you know, it's I know I've sort of gone off topic from what was going on in the Provisional Government, but what's very interesting is that people often say, oh, but Marx would have said that you have to wait for this revolution to occur.
You need the bourgeois stage of history first, and then you can move on to the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's the sort of traditional Marxist line.
Yeah, because what Marx believed was that society runs through what is called like the historical material. That, you know, when Marx writes, one, it's incomprehensible, but two, it's just a joke. By the way, that's not just my opinion. A professor once famously said that to me, you know, this guy did maths, you know, and PhD, and he seemed like, I didn't understand a word he's saying. I just go, oh, that's the secret. No one does. But the historical material believes in this idea of historical epochs, right? That it's this very scientific view of history, that history moved through a linear process. So first you had feudalism, then you have capitalism. And it's only when capitalism runs its full course, when you have produced something nearing material abundance, but with all the problems of capitalism in terms of chaos and, you know, ups and downs of the business cycle, and the sort of severing of inequality between this proletariat and the bourgeoisie who do own property and the means of production. I know I'm throwing out a lot of words, but it takes a long time to describe all these factors in very specific tones. Yeah. And then eventually you have socialist revolution, because then the proletariat could kill.
But you need to have the capitalist phase
first. So if this is the critique, hallelujah, alhamdulillah, right? We're there, right? Actually, the 1917 revolution should have never happened, and we should wait for capitalism to complete its quick course. But if we go by that view, surely the socialists today should ask themselves, shouldn't we instinctively break down as much of what socialist state has been created and allow capitalism to go absolutely further and further until we reach that breaking point? I mean, that's kind of the funny...
Oh, what, you could make an argument for acceleration?
Oh, yeah, acceleration. I mean, it's true. I think some Marxists did. I can't remember exactly the names, but, you know, they talked about this idea that maybe, you know, accelerationist capitalism is the way forward.
Yeah.
And I think this is kind of the view of people like... Aaron Bastani, who wrote that book, Luxury Communism, where, you know, you've
fully automated.
That's it. Yes. I mean, he's a cool guy, but, you know, I mean, I'm not sure, because it's kind of like the same problem why Marx thought the socialist revolution was going to happen in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Because he thought technological innovation ended with the power loom. So now all the socialists believe that technological innovation ends with AI.
Yeah.
But the truth is capitalism always finds a way to become more and more innovative.
Yeah.
And so...
But if we could circle back to Lenin.
Sorry, yes.
So Lenin thinks you can basically speed run this phase of history and complete it in a few weeks.
But not just on his own accord. I mean, actually, it's not that big of a break from Marx. Because what a lot of the socialists want to tell you is, but that is Marxist-Leninism, not Marxism. But actually, Marxist-Leninism has to instinctively come from Marx. And actually, in his own personal correspondence with the Russian... Marxists that originally existed in the 1890s and 1880s and the 1870s, namely Georgy Plekhanov and Vera Sasluzic, he says to them, actually, Russia could do this.
Yeah.
Based on two things. One, the peasant communes. Hey, that looks like a good basis for this idea of collectivization that I like. So maybe, even though his deep hatred of the peasantry is petty bourgeois, if you force them to collectivize, this is actually very communist, you know, almost what he would call Oriental communism, right? This idea that you would sort of, everyone would sort of collectively own the land and farm the land, as they kind of did under the Mir.
Yeah.
But the second point is, he said, an international, because communism, the social revolution happens, an international stage, right, happens globally, that Britain and Germany, who he believed were at the forefront of the revolution because they were the most technologically advanced, he wasn't quite there in time to see America's big rise. They will come in and they'll provide you all the technology capital and material abundance you'll need to build your socialist state.
Yeah, we'll just be the spark. Basically,
yes. Yeah, we'll
spread across Europe, and then that will, you know, rescue us from the difficulty of having to build socialism in one country.
Yeah, which is something that comes a bit later. Yeah, in terms of the phrase.
Okay. So, skipping ahead a bit, we have the October. We have the October Revolution, where the Bolsheviks and the Petrograd Soviet basically take over, remove the Provisional Government. They end up becoming dominant in most of Russia. There is then a civil war that breaks out. But let's try and stick to the economics.
Let's go for the economics.
What is war communism?
Well, there is a de jure version of war communism, and then there's a de facto version of war communism. War communism, from its standpoint, so when Lenin comes to power in 1917, he essentially, most of his moves with the economy is essentially to get Bolsheviks to sort of gain some degree of legitimacy. So this first becomes the decree on land,
where he gives them...
He basically says, the peasants have your land, so they just sort of take over the land and what they want. But beginning with the Civil War in 1918 against the white armies, who are the people who were like, actually, we want Russia to be a republic and a democratic republic, so we're going to try and defend this. Not many people were calling necessarily for the return of the Tsar. They find themselves in this really tricky situation. They're faced by sort of the realities of the war. And so suddenly what they need is manpower, and they need food, and they need to basically, run a successful war. So de jure what it is also, and on top of that, they think, okay, well, how does Germany win a war? Because I was looking at Germany, and I think that's a very cool model. This goes back to that sort of infantilization of state capitalism. They go, well, the government control all this process, right? Because the government is a much better manager of economic systems than the chaotic free market. So what they do is they install a set of policies, which is all about the state gaining more and more control of the economy to then run the war, which can be broken down into the fact that they nationalize all industry, right? So that's a very big part of trying to control the war, direct munitions. That's a key part. They go into the countryside and start, contrary to the decree on land, start seizing grain from the peasants to try and feed the war effort. And then, so that's sort of what we could say is because of the need for the war.
Yeah.
But then they start mixing in the ideology, and suddenly a lot of people like Lenin and Trotsky start thinking maybe this is the perfect opportunity to use this military capacity to force this revolution even quicker. And that's why it's called war communism. And the two key parts of this, the first key part is how they go into seizing the grain from the peasants. They're not just seizing the grain from the peasants going, oh, we just need this to feed the war effort, as the Tsar did.
Yeah.
No, they're starting to think, actually, how do we get rid of this anomaly of our Marxist thinking, which is the fact is that peasants shouldn't really be within our proletarian society, because they represent small landholders, right? They're petty bourgeois, as Marx would call them. Marx famously described peasants as the epitome of backwardness and rural idiots. He wasn't particularly pleasant about them. And so what Lenin calls for is a ruthless war against the kulaks. And who are the kulaks? So this is now their strategy of how to build this socialist society or communist society, is that what they'll do is they'll ensure that the poorer peasants attack the richer peasants, who are these kulaks, right? The kulaks are actually like almost a mirror to the urban situation, the abusers and exploiters of the poorer peasants. And so what they need is to make the poorer peasants wage class war against these richer peasants, the kulaks, who essentially, let's be honest, were the most efficient, productive peasants who essentially had 4 acres and a mule.
Yeah.
And so they use war communism and the need to requisition this grain as also a chance to inflict this red terror in the countryside, where they essentially sent out soldiers, but also told the poorer peasants start attacking and killing off these supposed kulaks. The second element, which is really interesting, is the fact that because the economy essentially was in virtual collapse, you had this huge inflationary crisis. I think prices increased by like a factor of 8,000 during this period, which is a huge amount, right? And because of this inflationary pressure, money is losing its value.
Yeah.
Now, rather than a wartime government going, oh, crap, how do we stop this? They go, oh, no, this is a great opportunity to achieve communism, because communism necessitates that money doesn't exist from each according to his ability to each according to his need. So what they say that they actually start doing is they start paying the soldiers and workers in rations, and they also run the public transport system based off that. So they're getting rid of money that way. And there are musings within the party suggesting that this is the perfect time to abolish money. It doesn't become formalized in law.
Yeah.
But, so what war communism is it's this amazing thing where they're both simultaneously doing it because of the necessities of the war, but they're also doing it because of the necessity of ideology and this feeling like actually we can do this and even quicker than we expected to create communism by abolishing money, getting rid of the richer peasants, and forming this new coalition with the poorer peasants called the Smirchka, that, they could create this socialist communist society. So yeah, I mean, it's
so it's a hugely accelerated program of sort of radical socialist reform. You nationalize essentially all of the economy that legally exists as far as you can.
But de facto, the state doesn't have a lot of the capacity to do a lot of this. So what instead happens is the factories go into disuse. The ones that are running are under worker control, so they're not under the control of the state. So there isn't really, the command economy is not functioning as you'd expect maybe under Stalin. And on top of that, in the countryside, even though they are requisitioning a lot of grain where they can reach, and they're, launching this ruthless war against the kulaks, they don't reach a lot of the regions that are actually on the border of the fighting.
Yeah.
And this is why they ultimately win the civil war. Because actually it was the state's weak capacity which ensured that the peasants on the front line who were fighting against the whites were like, oh, actually the Bolsheviks are on our side because we're fighting our old landlords who were very oppressive. And then eventually they'd find out what Bolshevik rule really meant.
Yeah.
But Lev Kritzman, who's an a Soviet economist, said that actually in reality what war communism was this pure proletarian, natural anarchistic economy, right? Because it was just this anarchy, right?
Yeah.
Between peasants just seizing the land they want, the factories going into disuse or doing whatever they can to just get over the line.
Yeah.
And so in essence, what you have is a kind of what a lot of those anarcho-socialists want, right? Which is this kind of crazy kind of free-for-all of communal ownership.
Where theoretically it's all centrally controlled and planned, but in reality there's nothing.
No.
Yeah.
Other than just sporadic inputs of violence.
Yeah. Okay, and then as a sort of a final point for this video, this is when the new economic policy comes in under Lenin. Now, what's the new economic policy? Why does Lenin pursue this, and what are its effects?
So the new economic policy, or the NEP, or as socialists would call it, the new exploitation of the proletariat, which is always my favourite little turn of phrase. It's essentially Lenin, by 1921, they've won the war, but war communism has caused a lot of damage to the economy. So industries are not functioning. There's a huge famine that breaks out. And also, there's a lot of peasant resistance. There's something called the workers' opposition. So people are actually sort of standing against the Bolsheviks for being undemocratic, even their traditional support base. And this all culminates in the Kronstadt Stalers, who are this key military force that had supported the Bolsheviks into power, had now turned against them and sort of gone into a mutiny. So this forces Lenin to completely reconsider the state's policy, and this is why they go into the new economic policy, which Lenin described as taking one step back to take two steps into the future. So there are debates as to whether new economic policy comes in because it's out of necessity or because there's actually some genuine socialist thought into it, and you can kind of mix it into both. Ultimately, what it is, it's a mixed economy.
Yeah.
The commanding heights, as Lenin would call it, of industry would be fully nationalized and come under the command economy run by a mix of the VSNH, which is the Supreme Council of the National Economy, and Gosplan, which is the State Planning Committee, which eventually gets its real full-throttled usage under Stalin. And they would run these big industries, these commanding heights, that was coal, steel, banking. Then the remaining big industries would be nationalized, but sort of told to do capitalist cost accounting. So be profitable, try and reduce costs, engage with the market. But then any industry that employed less than 20 people, any enterprise, like in textiles, for example, they were allowed to be privately owned.
Yeah.
And more importantly, at the center of the NEP was that agriculture was then allowed to operate under a free market. And the reason for this, if you're looking at the necessity point, is to essentially keep the peasants on their side because of basically what they were trying to achieve during war communism. So they had to, because it's a majority peasant country, and by the way, most of the proletariat have died during the Civil War fighting for the Bolsheviks, they have to have these people on their side. So it's a concession. But also, so people start seeing it as a viable way to actually get to socialism, because actually you do kind of need to get through a bit of a capitalist phase and produce something to get to that point. So that's what NEP really is. And NEP is kind of seen, if you're a sort of a much more liberal view of the history, it's the golden age, because finally food is on the shelves. I mean, so by 1923, so it comes in 1921, already by 1923, 75% of the output that was being produced in 1913 has been recovered in agriculture.
Yeah.
So food is on the shelves. You get sort of peasants who are able to produce more surpluses, which they, of course, start calling kulaks, because any sort of success is seen as bad, even if you're feeding people. And then you get these NEP men who are obviously getting and exporting the grain and creating the distribution networks to get the grain, who are also critically viewed because, oh no, they're actually getting the food to people and selling it for a profit. So that's the sort of positivist view. The negativist view is that, this is an aberration of socialism. If we believe that markets are inherently bad, which is, this is the big contradiction with Marx. You need capitalism to get to socialism, but capitalism is inherently bad. Okay. So, and he also says, well, cooperatives and collective ownership, that's better than capitalism. It's even more efficient. So they just go, well, we'll just do that, right? And that's what they were planning to do with the industry. But what happens with industry? It just is crap. Oh, sorry, it's bad. Sorry. But it doesn't very well. So at the same time, there's that huge improvement in agricultural output. Industrial output only recovers by about 23%. I think that was in steel specifically. So what happens is, it's great to be a small enterprise and it's great to be in agriculture, but it's really bad if you want any industrial goods, because it's run by this command economy.
Yeah.
And
so the people who are doing well out of this are exactly the sort of people who the Bolsheviks, or as it's renamed, the Russian Communist Party, are innately suspicious of. Small businessmen and small landholders.
Yeah, because they're doing well.
Yeah.
And there is a sort of growing inequality happening in the cities. Now, they would say, well, so you admit the growing inequality, therefore we had to resolve it. But the reason there's growing inequality is because the workers who are involved in industry are not obviously getting higher pay or going through innovation or sort of enjoying the spoils of economic growth, because what's happening in industry is it's retarding quite a lot.
Yeah.
And you can see this through what is called the scissors crisis of 1923, which is, and that was coined by Trotsky. Now, you'll be glad to know that had nothing to do with a shortage of scissors, but that probably was happening as well. But what the scissors crisis is that as agriculture is opened up to the market, peasants are producing more to actually, get a profit. The distribution networks exist to get it to people. The supply of grain in the country radically increases. And of course, as we know, when supply increases, prices decrease. So on one angle, we see prices decline in agriculture. But in industry, where it's heavily ineffective, even in those industries that are told to act as capitalist cost accounters, because they're monopolies, essentially, there's no incentive to innovate, there's no competition. Prices in industrial goods start increasing because the supply is severely reduced, and you get this open pair of scissors where there's this huge gap between agricultural prices and industrial prices. And whereas we would look at this and go, well, we know the solution here is to introduce free market mechanisms into industry.
Yeah.
Right? So you can achieve the same growth. The Soviets are like, no. This is the evil peasants who are planning on rooting us out.
Yeah.
By essentially because what they're worried about is they see if the peasants aren't able to trade their grain with consumer goods and industrial goods from the cities, they'll start hoarding this grain. And while there is some debate within the history whether they were actually hoarding grain or not, of course, that would be a very logical response on their end, because you would sort of speculate and just wait for the price, for sort of something for you to actually buy. But they don't see it that way. So they respond by fixing industrial prices and essentially closing a lot of those small shops, even in the mid-20s. And so this all culminates eventually by 1928, where there's this split in the party of people who want to support the NEP and people who are against the NEP. And the people who support the NEP, Bukharin, Lenin is leaning that way.
Well, he's dead by 1920.
Oh, yeah. But before he died, in his final testament, he was leaning the way of supporting the NEP as a way to socialism, but reluctantly, with bited lip. And actually, he criticised Bukharin for being too supportive, because Bukharin gets kind of a bit wild with the NEP, and he tells people to get rich.
Which isn't what you're supposed to be doing as a communist.
He's my favourite. I think that's, even though he used to be a left-winger in the party. But he believes that what can happen here is that if the peasants accumulate lots of capital and savings, they'll start sending those savings into industry, which then will allow for this industrialization to occur. But on his opposite angle, who's fighting against him? Every left-winger's favourite person, Trotsky. Trotsky and the Soviet economist Pribozhinsky, who are saying, actually, no, this is going to... The peasants will never give us the savings to invest into industry. So what we need is primitive socialist accumulation. And what primitive socialist accumulation is essentially what Stalin does, which is the belief that you extract and requisition all the capital from these peasants. So all that capital that they're hiding and all that grain that they're hiding, you steal it from them, you bring it into the cities, and you use that to industrialize. And you can force industrialization through this method. And essentially by 1928, the party is really leaning in this direction. And it is Stalin, after a bit of a bad harvest in 1928, goes, right.
Who gets this done? For better and mostly worse.
It gets so much worse.
Yeah. Well, that is about all we have time for this episode. But next episode in this series, we will be discussing just that. Stalin's rejection of the NEP, collectivization, the 5-year plans, and the effects of the Second World War. So if you would like to read the article that goes with this video, you can look in the description and you will find a link. But until next time, stay non-communist.
Adios.